To hear about one of our favorite citizens and legendary citizens, and a man who all these things applied to, John Bryan of Ohio, as he'd like to refer to himself, John Bryan of Ohio. I'm not sure who he was distinguishing himself from. But,
Man of the state.
and we see his name still today, 100 years, almost 100 years after he died, in a lot of places around town. The state park sign, John Bryan Community Center, John Bryan State Park, and yet we ask, who was this man? And he's a hard man to find out a lot about. Digging into his history is difficult because he, I think very intentionally, didn't allow some of his history to come out. He also, as we'll find out, was an active businessman in Cincinnati who tried to keep his Cincinnati business life separate from his life here in Yellow Springs. Very little is known about his early years. The base history of John Bryan was actually written by the late Julie Overton as a thesis in the public history program at Wright State in 1978. She had one advantage that we don't have today. She had access to people around town who still had been alive, who were still living and had been alive when John Bryan was around, and had stories to tell about John Bryan. How much truth there were to some of those stories, it's a little unclear. But so she was able to interview folks who had known John Bryan. The disadvantage she had is she had to do research the old way. She had to slog it out in the books, in the newspapers on microfilm, and dig through, and it's pretty clear that there's a lot that she didn't find out that we have because of an advantage we have today. And last fall, Nick Buddhist asked me if I had any history on the Bryan Center tract, because they were applying, Glen Helen Association was applying for a grant with TLT to clean up and protect the portion of that tract that's along the creek, basically the woods, the amphitheater, the remains from the old hotel. And I started digging, and I had information on most of it. It was a really interesting history of that tract, going back probably into the 1750s because of being the ford on the creek. But what I couldn't find out much about was the amphitheater, the history of the amphitheater that's there behind the Bryan Center. And so, but I kept finding leads on the internet to newspaper articles, Xenia Gazette articles from the 1930s that seemed like they might be a possibility. So I subscribed, and it was one of these deals where you can get 7 days free access to something called newspapers.com, which gives you access to a lot of online full-text newspapers. Gazette is one, Cincinnati Enquirer is another one that they have. And I got so fascinated and so distracted by looking into these newspapers that I let my 7 days expire and forgot to cancel it, and all of a sudden found I had a year subscription to newspapers.com. But it was a tremendous amount. When I was just started putting in local topics, I put in John Bryan and got hundreds and hundreds of hits. And that's really what the basis of this this talk is on. And there are inherent advantages and disadvantages both to newspapers research. You get a lot of currency when you read the newspapers, a lot of breaking news as it's happening, but you don't always get in-depth reporting. You don't always get facts as opposed to the story, and you don't always get a follow-up. And part of one of the things that I'm faced with here is there are some things that are really enticing, really interesting, but they appeared once in the paper and then they just disappeared, and there's nothing more to learn. There is more to learn, but there's nothing more that I could learn, at least without some additional research. But my initial reaction after reading some of the articles, particularly the early articles about John Bryan in the 1890s when he first moved to Yellow Springs, made me think of one person in particular. Kim Kardashian. If you've heard that WYSO teaser for some program, they say, and so maybe you've heard of the Kardashians, and there are people who are famous for being famous. And John Bryan, in his time, was a little bit that way. He was famous for being famous. The headlines just referred to him as millionaire, farmer, poet, soap manufacturer of Yellow Springs. And the newspapers across the country picked up some of these articles. And it's clear because it wasn't unusual in those days for newspapers to steal from each other. And so an article would appear in one newspaper and then another newspaper would pick it up. But these were happening so simultaneously, if you will. The articles were appearing in multiple newspapers across the country at the same time, that it's clear that John Bryan was his own best spokesman. And John Bryan, throughout his history, sometimes more than others, sent basically news releases. They were letters, but they got picked up like news releases to the newspapers to further his own story, if you will, or to explain his side of the story. And in later years, when he couldn't get the newspapers to publish his letters, he'd pay for his letters to be published, and some of his political views in particular, he would pay newspapers to publish them, and you can tell when there were ads and so forth that in fact he had bought, even though they might have looked like a letter. So he was a really interesting character. And I'm going to start this. I say sometimes, just telling people about our situation, we've lived in Yellow Springs for 21 years, but that moving into a small town is like opening a novel in mid-story. You're living the story going forward, and sometimes gradually you find out what happened beforehand, but sometimes it's a mystery. You don't exactly understand quite how things work. And we're going to start that way with John Bryan. We're going to start in August of 1896, when the first report about a man named John Bryan coming to Yellow Springs appeared in the Xenia Gazette. And what it actually was, it was the news from Clifton that appeared in the Xenia Gazette in August of '96, and it mentioned that John Bryan and wife, and that'll come back, we'll hear more about that, of New York City, and Mr. Lawrence of Yellow Springs called on Mr. I.T. Confer in Clifton on Monday evening. And it goes on to say a little bit that he's looking for potential property in the area. That's all the story goes on. A month later, the Gazette reported that Mr. John Bryan, a bachelor of charming personality. So I'm not quite sure what happened to the wife in the meantime, but I think we'll find out. Yellow Springs to have quite an addition to their village, socially, financially, and otherwise, by the removal there of Mr. John Bryan, poet, inventor, philanthropist, and millionaire, a bachelor of charming personality who came on from New York a few weeks ago on a visit to a friend and decided to locate in Ohio. He will purchase the lovely country home Riverside, belonging to Mr. M.O. Adams, the consideration being $13,000 cash and possession to be given in 30 days. Well, $13,000 in 1896 is about $350,000 for the 350-acre Riverside Farm property. And by the way, not only was he going to be here for the ladies of Yellow Springs, the article went on to say, here he will reside, and as he has 4 bachelor brothers who will visit him often, the charming young ladies of Yellow Springs are quite excited over the acquisition of their classic town. Mr. Bryan was originally from Ohio, but the past few years, actually 1 year, have been spent in New York, where he has acquired an immense fortune by the invention of electrical appliances. I think he was actually fleeing some legal difficulties in Cincinnati, but we'll talk about that in a minute too. A little bit about Riverside Farm. This is a house no longer stands at Riverside Farm, and there were 2 large properties in the township, in Miami Township, that belonged to the first millionaire, as he's been called, in Ohio, Martin Baum of Cincinnati. Martin Baum is the man who built the, what's now the Taft Museum in downtown Cincinnati, that beautiful house in the 1820s. He was a merchant, and like a lot of people in early Ohio, he was a real estate speculator. And he speculated in particular around the Yellow Springs. And at one time he was a part owner of the tract that had the Yellow Springs on it. He was owner of 2,000 acres that he gave to his son that became Whitehall Farm eventually. And he was also the owner of 500 acres that he gave to his daughter, Mary Ewing, Mary who would become Ewing, it became Riverside Farm, and then what we now know as John Bryan State Park. Mary actually lived in Yellow Springs the 1850s up until about the time of the Civil War. She was instrumental in the founding of the Presbyterian Church, and she arranged for the Presbyterian Church to be designed by an architect in Cincinnati by the name of James McLaughlin. He was probably the most prominent architect in Cincinnati in the second half of the 19th century. He designed a whole number of buildings that are still standing, but including the original building of the Cincinnati Art Museum. And if you've ever been in the Art Museum, there's the rotunda, and that's part of that original building. But he, in addition to the Presbyterian, and I just found this out last summer by accident because I know someone in Cincinnati who has his ledger book. He also designed a house in Yellow Springs for $50 for Martin Baum Ewing, Mary Ewing's son, and it was this house at Riverside Farm, or what became John Bryan State Park. Well, Bryan closed on the purchase of the farm in the fall of 1896, and by 1897 the publicity machine was in full gear, and he announced to the world basically his views on farming, and didn't really have a lot of background in farming, but he advocated something called diversified, intensified farming. And his view, as explained in newspaper articles, was that we could make better use of the land, we could figure out how to use it better by putting particular people. He was going to have departments of his farm and different people in charge of those departments to bring the most out of the farm. Now, he had a lot of good ideas, but one of his less good ideas, and we'll talk about in a minute, was his idea of raising raccoons commercially, which I guess was one of the departments. And the articles mentioned that one of his departments, his poultry departments, was under the supervision of a woman who was also his personal secretary and stenographer, Mrs. Mary Stuhler from New York. And she'll come back into the story later on. But he started in the summer of 1897, he invited the Granges of Greene, Clark, and Montgomery County to have a mass meeting at Riverside Farm. He announced that 150 acres, the the hilliest part down near the river where the house was going to be a park and open to the public. He invited people, he showed them around, he had these big meetings. He estimated in 1897 he had 50,000 people visit Riverside Farm. And at this Grange convention, he broke ground on what was going to become John Bryan's barn. And this is one of the legendary things about John Bryan's barn. If you ever read about John Bryan's barn, which was gone before I moved to Yellow Springs, I think it was torn down in the 1960s. It was either the largest, or whatever the source you read, the second largest barn in the world. Second only to the Tsar of Russia or somebody in that area who had a bigger barn. And it may or may not be true, but John Bryan was promoting this biggest barn in the world in the newspapers before he ever broke ground on it. And it appears that he was the source of most of the accounts that it was the largest barn in the world. But it was a very big barn, and at that grain convention, they laid the cornerstone. And he announced that he was going to have a fall farm festival, the crowning of Ceres, which was a god of agriculture from Roman times, and all these people were going to come to celebrate the completion of the barn. Just 3 months after it was started. Well, he ended up calling that off because he'd gotten the stone foundation done on the barn, which was all quarried from a quarry there on the farm, but none of the superstructure was finished until the next year. And I think I've got here. This is an account of the barn, written by John Bryan. As I am my own architect and superintendent of construction, I have made no formal drawings. I can see the building in imagination as well as after it shall be materialized. If you come to see us, I should be very glad to give you much oral description as I might. It will be in the form of an L. The main building will be 200 by 70 feet, so good-sized building, with an annex of 80 by 70 feet. It will be 2.5 stories high with mill roof, 2 hips on a slope. The first story will be of stone, of the quality usually built into colleges or churches. The interior arrangement will be such as will best accommodate the various departments of the farm and park. There will be a bank drive into the north front and south end of the second story, and within those will be cellars for fruits, roots, vegetables, etc. There will be a tool room, a harness room, carriage and wagon rooms, a repair shop, a carpenter shop, a blacksmith shop, an office, and sleeping apartments for the employees. There will be running water throughout the barn and apartments for breeding animals after the most modern ways. He also then mentions that he's building a row of cottages for visitors to the farm that are going to be named Poets Row, Dramatic Row, Artistic Row, and Musical Row. These will be at the disposal of my friends for literary, artistic, and philosophical association, rest, and recreation. The barn is only just one accessory. And here is John Bryan's barn as built. Notice the way the ramps are. And this, I actually don't know the history. This seems to be a trait of barns in this area that you don't see in other parts of the state, where the bank or ramp to the barn has a gap and almost like a bridge from the end of it into the barn. You see that a lot in this area, but you don't necessarily see it in other places. Got another photograph. There's another photograph on it. He also, in his 150-acre park along the river, he named various areas of the park. And one of my favorite one was the Glen of Easy Wooing. The little Miami. He had a sign on the entrance to the park at that point, and it says on one side you see as you're going in, it said, "Welcome. please do not hitch your horses on the grass. On the reverse side, it said, come again and bring the peace of liberty, justice, and gentleness with you. So that was really the first year. Not everything worked perfectly, because there was also a report in the paper about him having to chase chicken thieves at gunpoint. And that article ended by saying, Mr. Bryan will encourage the breeding of fowls with enough intelligence to give the alarm when molested on the perch. They will be called the squallers. And so after, and I wish I had a photograph of this, or a picture of this. After a year or so, I mentioned before, the newspaper started carrying reports of his experiment to show farmers how to utilize wasteland. And this was part of his intensified, diversified farming. And this article said about and these articles appear in the oddest places because he was sending them out en masse, I'm sure. And it just happened to be whichever newspaper picked it up. This came from North Adams, Massachusetts newspaper, this particular article, although I found it one or two other places as well. The most unique, unique feature about his intensified, diversified farming is his coonery, which will be built as soon as the weather will permit. Mr. Bryan has advertised for 100 coons and has already secured several. There was a later article that's making fun of this and said that he got offered more raccoons from more people. Because he was offering $50 a piece for those things, which shows that he didn't have much experience with raccoons yet. They will be placed in his large barn until the coonery is constructed. There are 4 varieties: black, white, gray, and brown. The black pelts are the most valuable, and that was supposedly what he was raising them for, was fur. Mr. Bryan figures that these 100 coons will raise 500 young in 1 year, which may be true. As the pelts are worth about $1 a piece, he would realize $500 a year from them. The cost of feeding will be small, as the coons will secure almost enough food from the nuts, acorns, herbs, and roots to be found in the coonery, which will contain 5 acres of wooded land lying southeast of Mr. Bryan's residence. And then it goes on to tell about a large number of dens will be built over the 5 acres where they can lie during the winter when they are dormant. And then all along in February or March, as soon as the weather moderates, the coons will begin to stir and mate. It is Mr. Bryan's intention to place a few skunks in the coonery and see how they do. Coons and skunks seem to live together peacefully. The establishing of this coonery is to demonstrate that every inch of space on a farm can be used to advantage. The land is of no value unless it can be used for something like this. This article that appeared a number of years later said that the experiment ended when the raccoons got out and killed all the chickens. So that was not one of the more successful experiments that he had. He also, and this is like I say, a lot of his ideas really were good, and they were ahead of their time. Not all of them were bad ideas like that one. And he was promoted really through all his life once he moved to Yellow Springs, growing of more grass and less corn and really weren't soybeans then, but less of the feed crops, especially for land like his, much of which was rough and not particularly the most productive land around. He was a big early promoter in the United States of alfalfa, but he promoted in the late 1890s several meetings, just one at his farm and another at Antioch College, which had the misleading titles of the grass conferences. And they were an interesting mix of farming practice. He brought in scientists to talk about farming practice, but he also brought in politicians as well. And one of the reports on the grass conference that was held in the Miami Grass Conference, it was called, that was held at Antioch, refers to this intense debate that broke out in the middle of the conference on whether or not to build a new courthouse in Xenia. So it's not quite clear how that happened. But so he's working in Cincinnati. We don't know too much about, at this point, at least if you read the local papers, about what exactly he's doing in Cincinnati. But the headlines, which started off referring to him as the millionaire poet, are more and more referring to him as a millionaire eccentric poet when he appears. And then in 1906, 1907, we have really what's probably the most bizarre episode in his life, and it makes you want to know more, really. And it started in 1906. He was, there was a lawsuit filed against him by Mary Stuhler, his stenographer, who, it was a suit for damages, because she said he had whipped her, hit her with a whip, and she claimed $25,000 damages. She then later amended that complaint to ask for another $25,000 for breach of promise of marriage. And the facts slowly came out, and I think we've got more or less the facts, but whether it's all the facts is another question. There was a young lady by the name of Frederica Murphy, who was 20 years old at that point, who was also on the farm with her mother. And she had started, as these facts came out, at age 13, she was working in John Bryan's soap factory in Cincinnati. And he apparently took a liking to her. I have no idea if it had anything to do with this, but one of the newspapers, and this was still a pretty chaste time, referred to her as a buxom blonde. He took a liking to her and put her through the Cincinnati Conservatory of Music. And apparently she visited the farm quite often with her mother. And Mary Stuhler, the stenographer that was in charge of the chickens, took it poorly that she was around, and one morning came out of the barn with a whip and a gun after Frederica Murphy. And John Bryan got in the middle of it and claimed claimed that Stuhler was having what he referred to as a brainstorm, and grabbed the whip from her and whacked her on the arm with it pretty hard, I think. And so, interestingly, the Yellow Springs News never really covered any of this. The Xenia Gazette and the Cincinnati Enquirer, though, went to town. And the fact that the young girl was 20 years old, the fact that Mary Stuhler claimed that she had come from New York with a promise of marriage. She'd gone back to New York after a couple of years, and he had enticed her to, John Bryan had enticed her to come back. And this whole episode got pretty messy. John Bryan was trying to litigate in part, or defend himself in part, in the newspapers, so the newspapers would have his version of what happened. But the story gets more bizarre, because in the spring of, so the trial gets put off, and in the meantime, in that, he claims, and as far as I know it's true, he was taking a team in a wagon up that ramp, up one of the ramps into the barn, and was too close to the edge and went over the bank and was unconscious lay there unconscious for a couple of hours until somebody found him. And there are some people, and Julie Overton thought this may have been the case, that that really affected him, although it was after the episode with the whip, and really changed his approach to things, but to life. But in any event, he recovered from that, but partly because of his illness. The trial got put off until the spring of 1907, and it was held to a jury trial. The jury came back and awarded the Mary Stuhler $1,200, which was a fair amount of money, but certainly not the $50,000 she was asking for on the count of damages or injury, not the count of breach of promise. There was lots of going back and forth between the two in the newspapers, and he said he's going to appeal it. He didn't think he ought to pay anything, and he's going to, justice is going to be served. She said she's going to publish her memoirs and tell all about the story. That was her threat. As far as I know, she never did. I really can't find much of any trace of her. I can't find a picture, although we know at least one picture. One of the newspapers in passing mentioned that when the cornerstone for the barn was laid, there was a box, a Times capsule type of thing with a number of papers and photographs, and that one of the photographs was a picture of John Bryan with his stenographer, Mary Stuhler. So there's also another account that in the Yellow Springs News, I think it was, that John Bryan and Mary Stuhler had returned from a trip around the east and the south. So they definitely traveled together. So the day after the trial, the jury verdict is awarded, the papers come up with this story that John Bryan is in his lawyer's office giving interviews to the newspaper, to the Xenia Gazette at the time. He's negotiating a prenuptial agreement with Frederica Murphy, the 20-year-old. And he says, I don't know if we're going to get it worked out, but if we do, we're going to get married. They did apparently work it out. He claimed that one of the terms, really the only term that was publicized, was that she couldn't take the stage or sing in public for 20 years. He later said, well, that wasn't quite true. There was nothing that would stop her from singing. But before they got married, so they get the prenuptial agreement worked out. John Bryan, who considers himself, I don't know, he claims he studied, we don't know what he studied, if anything, but he claims to have studied law, medicine, and geology at various times. He went to Columbus, to the Supreme Court Law Library, to research which states' marital laws are the most favorable. And based on that, he decides they're going to get married in Missouri. So they leave the next day on the train for St. Louis to get married. And he gets to St. Louis, and I don't think I have the quote with me, but he's staying in a big hotel. They're staying in a big hotel in St. Louis, and he starts asking around, because one of the things I haven't mentioned, he was very anti-organized religion. We're not really quite sure. He claimed that organized religion had accounted for most of the wars in the United States, or in the world, I mean, and that may have been it. Julie Overton had a theory that because he grew up in Auglaize County, he saw the German Catholic immigrants and the German Protestant immigrants in the little towns like New Bremen and Minster fighting with each other constantly, and that got him turned off. But we don't really know. But he was going to have his wedding done by a justice of the peace. He asked around, and somebody in the hotel, the clerk in the hotel, said, well, you know, there's a justice of the peace in one of the suburbs in Clayton, Missouri, who advertises on the trolleys. He said, and it was something, I'm paraphrasing a little bit, it was something like in his signs, you provide the love and affection, come to Clayton, we'll do the rest. And so they went to Clayton, had they were going to have their wedding ceremony outside the courthouse in Clayton. Apparently, the Frederica, the fiancée, decided she didn't want to have it in public, out in the trees, under the trees of the courthouse. So they went inside into the auditor's office and got married in the auditor's office, turned around and came back to Cincinnati. She was quoted, though, as in one of the newspapers in Missouri as saying that they not only came out to do the wedding, but they thought they'd buy some mules while they were out there. So whether they did or not, I don't know. But it sort of starts revealing some of his beginnings when all this came out. And what we don't know a lot, we still don't know a lot, but he was born in Auglaize County in Uniopolis in 1851. His parents were also, his father's name was John, and his mother's name was Minerva. There were, I think, 8 brothers and 1 sister, although I think half the brothers didn't survive to adulthood. But his father, at least on one occasion I found, it was referred to as doctor, but the census, it only shows that he was a farmer. 2 of his brothers did become doctors and practiced medicine. And like I said, John claimed that he had studied law and medicine and geology, and there's some account that he may have been on the Geological Survey in Kentucky, but we really don't know. There was also, and this is one of those little, puts a light on something, but the rest of the story isn't there. An article in the Cincinnati Enquirer in 1898, I think it was, 1898 or 1899, reported that John Bryan, and it's the same John Bryan because it mentions Yellow Springs and everything, was sued by his father, John, for lack of support under a new law that said that children had to support their parents. Well, what the story was there, I never found any account of that lawsuit being resolved or what was really behind it. And you know, John's response in the article was just that he had provided more support than his brothers had, and that was it. But that article mentioned that he had been assistant superintendent of schools in Sydney, up near that area. So how he got from there to where we know he is then in the late 1880s, early 1890s, is in Cincinnati with a company called, well here, that's Frederica Murphy, by the way. That came from the Yellow Springs News, thanks to Scott, in 1916. This was his company, Physician Supply Company, manufacturers of medical electric batteries, physicians and surgeons soap, and it was that soap that was the big thing. Right downtown Cincinnati, it was Lodge Street, and their offices were there pretty much the entire time that John was alive. Here's a postcard from 1903 advertising our physicians and surgeons soap. And I think this was the other side of his writing letters to the editor and letters to the newspapers that get published as news articles. He was an early advocate of marketing, and he marketed the soap pretty hard in different ways. I found an account that he came up with these expensive little motorized sales things. I think they had pictures of the soap on it that a merchant would have, and it would turn around and have different colors on it as a way of advertising the soap. That unfortunately doesn't come through in color for some reason, but this is a letterhead, and there you can see a box of the physicians and surgeons soap. Well, the batteries that they sold were used in medical treatment of some kind, and there was a big craze in that at that time of using electrical current in various treatments, but the soap seems to be the thing that he really made his money on. And he got tangled up in 1895, so just the year before he moved to Yellow Springs, keep the timeline in mind, with the Ohio Dairy and Food Commission, which was, this was the wave of food and drug laws in the latter part of the 19th century, trying to overcome some of the problems, like you know, you read some of the stories about the packing industry in Chicago and so forth. Well, they started coming down hard on various manufacturers that the Ohio Dairy and Food Commission didn't feel were doing a good job. And one of the people they came down hard on was John Bryan. And they filed a lawsuit in the spring of 1895. And it said he claimed that the soap was made from olive oil, bena oil, I'm not sure what that is, and cocoa butter. But when they analyzed it, it doesn't have any of those things in it. It's made of an inferior grade of oil. And there were lots of suits. It wasn't like he was picked out. I mean, there were lots of suits at the time. But they seemed to be going after his soap in particular, because they sued a couple of his customers, distributors, who turned around and sued him right away for the same thing. And the reports say that after he was sued, that he unceremoniously left the city, and that the Dairy and Food Commission tried to, they sent decoy letters to him in Washington, D.C., hoping that would entice him to come back. They didn't know he was in Washington, but there was some thought that's where he was. Then they also, arrested a woman by the name of Laura Pearson, who was one of his sales ladies, who also may have been a friend, because I found the wonders of Google, found an article from 2 or 3 years before from the Indianapolis newspaper saying that Mr. John Bryan and Mrs. Laura Pearson were visiting D.C. Pearson in Indianapolis, and so there may have been more to that relationship. But the idea, according to the National Trade Press, was that they arrested her trying to lure John Bryan out to come back and protect her, which he apparently didn't do. But then we never find out what happens to these lawsuits. They're all the news in 1895, but they disappear. John Bryan, it seems, went to New York City. And the one thing we know he did while he was in New York City for that year is publish this book. Despite him being constantly referred to as an author and poet and fabulist, this is the only book that we know he actually published. We found accounts he's about to publish others, or he advertises in the Cincinnati newspaper at one point because he's lost the manuscript for another book he's about to publish. But little fables and essays. He didn't believe in selling it, but and so most of the copies you'll see were autographed. This one, I think I've got it on here. Yeah, to Miss Lila Young, with compliments of the author, Riverside Farm in Park, Yellow Springs, Ohio, 1898. Turns out this Miss Lila Young was in Battle Creek, Michigan. I don't know how he got in touch with her, but she would, a couple of years later, do better than John Bryan, that's for certain. She married C.W. Post, the Post Toasties manufacturer, and when he died after a few years, she was left with a fortune of like $6 million. And she was very, very good benefactor for Battle Creek. It's also clear that he did a publicity campaign when this book came out. And by the way, the publisher, the Arts and Letters Company, I can't find any trace of the Arts and Letters Company. So I think it was probably sort of a vanity press. It also says here, 5,000, so it makes it sound like it's in the second edition. Nobody's ever found a copy that didn't say 50,000 on it, so that was probably another marketing thing. He sent his marketing approach. He sent this to newspapers all over the country, and again, thanks to the internet, I found reviews or notices of receiving a copy from, and this is a pretty broad range of publications, the Review of Reviews, New York Times, Godey's Magazine, the ladies' book, Popular Science, Good Government, Western Rural and Livestock Weekly, who had a long review of it. And in fact, later on in 1912, he would take a whole page ad in the, he must have still had copies left, because in the Cincinnati Enquirer, with all the reviews, or excerpts from all the reviews that he had gotten on this newspaper. So he skirts the issue with the Dairy and Food Commission in Ohio. The next year, he comes back to Yellow Springs, buys Riverside Farm, resumes his manufacturing with the Physicians Supply Company, which he'll own up until his death. I mean, that was one of the assets in his estate. It was worth, I think, $350,000, the stock of the company. Although there was another interesting episode, and I think it shows that maybe things didn't go all that smoothly for whatever reason with Frederica, because in a couple of years after they were married, there are articles in the Cincinnati papers that he is suing someone to return the stock of his company. And apparently what he did is he thought he had a friend who he sold the stock for really cheaply, because he was having domestic problems, according to John Bryan, and he wanted to put it in friendly hands. The guy wouldn't give it back to him, wouldn't sell it back to him, so he had to sue to get the stock back. And so that's an indication it must have been a little tempestuous with Frederica. Also, one of the things that came out of the interviews that Julia Overton did, people remembered apparently when John Bryan would take people through his house, he would show them like dents in the plaster where he'd say, "Oh yeah, Frederica threw a plate at me right there." Or another account that she had was that Frederica took a fire hose to John Bryan one time, and it had enough pressure that it kept him on the ground. She kept him on the ground. So that's interesting. So let's talk real quickly about John Bryan's inventions, because he's known as an inventor. He claims that he had lots of inventions prior to the time he came to Yellow Springs. He didn't patent them. He claimed he sold them and made money on them, but I can't find any evidence of those early patents. But he did come up with a number of patents that are really interesting, including this one, and all about the time of 1910. And his patent lawyer was a guy by the name of Harry Toolman from Springfield, one of the early patent lawyers in this region. There's a statue to him now because he was a patent lawyer to the Wright brothers. So he went first class. This was an invention to build for railroad cars, and you would use these containers on a railroad car, and here was a facility for picking the containers off the railroad cars and transshipping them into something else. So I've never seen him get credit for inventing the container system that's used on railroads today, but it's exactly what that is, what the patent is. So pretty amazing. He came up with it in 1910. Here was his view for eliminating floods, and he testified in front of Congress at one point on this invention. And it was basically to take out the bends of the river by building these concrete sluiceways between the bends, so that when the rivers got high, instead of the excess water going around the bends and flooding, it could be taken out of the area by basically using this sluiceway across the corners to get the water through fast. It's basically what they did in downtown Dayton after the 1913 flood, when Arthur Morgan re-engineered the Miami River to take out the bends south of downtown and make it straighter to get the water through faster. So, you know, another idea that seems like it had some merits. He had a plow that had this mechanism on it, so you could turn it and do it at various angles. His male personal secretary in later years wrote a series of articles out, and they weren't published around here. They were only published out in the Missouri area. And some of his memories of John Bryan, he said John Bryan had a whole barn full of agricultural equipment that he tinkered with his different ideas. And here was a ram pump system for taking water from a river without a dam and running it through a ram pump to then pump the water out. Another pretty good idea. But my favorite invention of John Bryan's was one he didn't have. And this is an excerpt, I'm going to read it to you because it's pretty good, from the American Magazine of Aeronautics. And I'm not sure exactly the year, about 1907, 1908. But you gotta use your imagination here. And so they're quoting from a newspaper article that appeared in Springfield. Up near Yellow Springs, Ohio, this is a letter from John Bryan. Up near Yellow Springs, Ohio, where I sometimes reside on Riverside Farm, we have two little black jackasses. We have a pack saddle resting upon a light frame support, just quite touching but not resting upon Jack's back. We now load 3 2-bushel sacks of wheat upon the pack saddle. The 3 sacks of wheat weigh 360 pounds. We now strap the pack saddle to the ass's back by broad, easy bands around his belly. We then attach the cords of a captive balloon or gas bag to the top of the pack saddle or load. The balloon's lifting strength is 400 pounds. That is, it lifts the 360 pound load and the 40 pounds of the jackass. That jackass now steps off with the 360 pound load and 40 pounds lighter than he could walk on his own legs without it. Nathan Clark, who was actually a neighbor, Nathan Clark, a 12-year-old boy, leads the ass away to the grain elevator at the village. Or by increasing the lifting power of the balloon by putting in a little more gas, Nathan can ride the ass and the ass not have any increase of his load. The ass only guides the balloon and affords the slight propulsion as it needs forward. So, can you imagine coming into town on 343 and seeing this little donkey walking by with balloons? Now, whether it really happened, I don't know, but you can imagine the 12-year-old boy would just really love it. So Nathan Clark, who lived, by the way, until 1968, I found his obituary in the Xenia paper. So I wish somebody could ask him, what did this really happen, and what did it look like? But that was another one of John Bryan's inventions. He was always thinking. He always had an idea, and you just never knew what was going to come out of his mind. So there's the Clark grocery. Incidentally, Clark, E.E. Clark, was a neighbor of John Bryan's, and they must have had a love-hate relationship, because early on when he had the whole episode that was going on with Mary Stuhler, and he sent Mary after that over to the Clarks, and the Clarks put her up and gave her a place to stay while that was all cooling off. And the son, Nathan Clark, was the one with the balloons and the donkey. But Clark was also arrested and fined $100 for slapping John Bryan in the face in downtown Yellow Springs because he claimed that John Bryan had owed him money, owed him $500 and wouldn't pay it, and then had paid his son, maybe Nathan, I don't know, it doesn't say, $100 to leave home so that he couldn't testify against John Bryan. So again, what the whole story of that episode was, I don't really know. So in 1916, one of the things that John Bryan is still remembered for is his gift to the village of the old Yellow Springs Hotel property, which is right here. This is Xenia. And so the hotel was right where the John Bryan Center is now. There was a row of cottages along the creek, and it had been a hotel since the 1830s. It was originally the house of Elisha Mills after he turned the Yellow Springs over to his son, William Mills. Elisha built a house here, and it eventually became a hotel, and operated as a hotel really until about 1899. And it was not very successful, even though they put a lot of money into it. In 1899, it was sold to the Methodists and became Methodist home for the aged, but it burnt in 1902. And incidentally, the Methodist home for the aged moved to Cincinnati after that, and in College Hill, there's a gigantic building that's still the Methodist home for the aged. It's called Twin Towers. But John Bryan bought this, and so in 1912, a delegation from the village looking around for where to build a new school. The Union School wasn't big enough anymore. They were going to build a new school, and they approached John Bryan, who was pretty reclusive at this point and wasn't really allowing very many people to be on the farm. He didn't like the village, and they went out and asked him, and I think they were a little surprised, but he said, yeah, I'll give it to you. I'll give it to you on 3 conditions. One condition, that it be open regardless of race to anyone. 2, that there no active religion can be practiced on the grounds. And 3, you don't build a basement. Where that last one came from, I don't know, other than he claimed to be a geologist, and he may have known that where that is, you'd be blasting into limestone in order to build a basement. So but in any event, the village never really said anything about the conditions. It was a lot of great publicity for John Bryan, and they accepted it. They thought it was a wonderful gift. It was estimated to be between $20,000, which again was about $350,000, $400,000 at the time. And one of John Bryan's friends, who came a few years before they gave it he gave it to the village, but Elbert Hubbard, who was a arts and crafts guy, Roy Crofters in upstate New York, visited Yellow Springs, stayed with John Bryan, and he, in sort of a rambling story for a magazine he published called FRA, F-R-A, talks about this site at that point after the fire of 1902. He said, in these old chimneys, thousands of swallows make their home. Where the kitchen once, because the ruins were still standing there, the ruins of the brick house. Where the kitchen once stood is a cellar so well built of stones that it affords a refuge for skunks who drive out families of foxes, and now ruled by right of squatter sovereignty. On the spacious lawn, or what was once a lawn, round holes gambol. There are long strings of whitewashed cottages, and the remains of what was once the great barn, because there was a big barn here for travelers' horses. Most of the wood having been carted away for fuel. Down in the valley are the jutting ruins of a beautiful stone wall where the spring was dammed to make an artificial lake. Most of that's still there. The size of the lake can be safely gauged by stone steps with big rusty iron rings where rowboats were moored and tied. The great stone steps, worn deep by the feet of travelers as they entered the tavern, are there too, but there's no tavern. The fountains are filled with watercress, fresh and crisp, over which the spring waters flow. So he was describing the ruin that John Bryan gave to the village. He also, I think this was interesting because he did stay with John Bryan at Riverside Farm. And he said, "The country around Yellow Springs is of rare beauty. Surely God has smiled upon the place. Such diversity of landscape once seldom sees. Gentle, undulating pastures studded with noble solitary oaks, fertile fields that laugh at a harvest on the side of an Oliver plow, woods as wild as nature made them, lining the bluffs of the Little Miami River, woods that house 100 kinds of birds, and hillsides that form a herbarium which would have delighted the soul of Linnaeus. These bluffs reveal the strata touched by the tooth of time, great masses of limestone from which run in steady streams, inexhaustible springs of pure and sparkling water. No wonder that the Indians called it a sacred place where the Great Spirit made his home." So Elbert Hubbard liked the area, but in the same article, in referring to John Bryan, who was his host, he refers to him as the king of cranks. So that's that. At this point, I guess the last thing I want to mention about John Bryan and his eccentricities was something that happened about the same time that he gave this hotel to the village. And that's something that I think really tainted his memory for a number of years after his death. And that's, for whatever reason, he was a strong advocate of the United States coming into World War I on the side of the Germans. He was very pro-German. He spent the summer of 1916 in Cincinnati with an organization he set up trying to promote German support for Germany in the early years before the United States actually got into the war, obviously, in 1916. And you wonder, I've never, any wrote articles that were published and so forth about it, but you wonder what he thought, because Albert Hubbard was his, a reasonable friend of his, a good friend of his, and Albert Hubbard, 100 years ago, next month actually, was on the Lusitania when it was hit by a German torpedo and died at that point. So what John Bryan thought about that is, we don't know. There's a picture of the Yellow Springs house in what's today 68, before the dip was filled in and the road leveled out, and the route changed a little bit. You can still see this part of the road in front of the Bryan Center if you look at the grass. There's Albert Hubbard. So one of the last things that John Bryan bought from Town Carlisle was the property that included the Yellow Springs on it, and the lake that's shown here. And I'll mention that in a minute, because it was only I think it was in 1917 that he bought that, 1916 or 1917. And it would cause some problems after his death. And his death came in 1918. In 1918, he was in Cincinnati, staying in a hotel, as he often did when he would go down there for his company. And the flu epidemic that was going across the country in the summer of 1918 caught John Bryan, and he died. And I think because of the German support, there wasn't a lot of commentary, but I actually thought that one of the most thoughtful accounts after his death appeared in the Yellow Springs News, which it was trying to, rather than the sensational about his eccentricities or whatever, it was trying to make some sense out of John Bryan. And this was in December 13th, 1918. Mr. Bryan was very peculiar in all of his dealings. At first, he welcomed visitors from afar and near and tried to make their visits to his place enjoyable, but of later years he had a change of heart and became distrustful of almost everyone, and but a few found a welcome there. For imaginary reasons, he took a dislike to the town and said many mean things about it, and boasted that he would never set foot in it again. But on top of all this, he has most generously deeded the town the beautiful site of the hotel for a schoolhouse. Last fall, he gave to Antioch $500 towards the building fund. Mr. Bryan was a man of many likes and dislikes. If he took a dislike to anything or anyone, he disliked them very hard. If he liked anyone, he was a friend worth having. Little is known of his early life, but it is thought he was between 60 and 65 years of age. Of his family and connections, he had little to say. Well, John Bryan, though, being the controversial figure that he was, wouldn't let things go with his death. And you can just see him in his death, or after he's wherever he was, since he didn't believe in religion, thinking about, just with glee over, this is the gate to his farm, which right before he died, he built a big gate over, and in fact, the month before he died, he wrote a letter to the state offering Riverside Park to the farm to the state for a nature museum, I think is the way he phrased it. But his last will and testament, of course, was in court for years. First, because that's why I started saying is he was probably very gleeful about all this. He left Frederica. His estate was worth about $1 million altogether. He put it in together. He left Frederica $100,000 because he told his personal secretary, $100,000 is all any woman needs. He left $1 to each of his surviving brothers, who he obviously had fallen out with. He left more to a personal secretary and his niece. And all the rest of his wife was supposed to have a life estate in the farm, but the farm he was giving to the state, or the state wouldn't take it to Greene County. And all the rest of the funds in his estate were supposed to go to publish his writings. Well, the court's two different things. One is conditions. He, other than the basement, he put the other two conditions: no practice of religion on the farm, and open to people regardless of race, on the conditions to the state. And Ohio being what Ohio is, 3 governors refused to accept the park. It wasn't until 1923 when a local committee supporting the state legislature from Clark County introduced legislation to force it to be accepted, and the Governor Donahue vetoed it, and they overrode his veto and forced the state to take the park in 1923. Frederica had the last laugh on her part of it, though, because the probate court in Cincinnati said that it was too vague to say that the money was going to be used to publish his writings, and so all of the money, all of the rest of the money in the state went to Frederica, who would marry and live the rest of her life in Columbus. So this is John Bryan. You have to say one of the most eccentric people who've ever lived in a town that's full of eccentric people. We've got the park to honor him, and we've got the Bryan Center to honor him. So that's my story of John Bryan. I think there's a lot more there. It would be great to learn more about his early history, and if we keep digging, we'll find out more as we go. So thank you. If anybody has a great desire to pay their dues for the Historical Society, Cindy Mutcher will take the money. And this is my notebook of the articles that I printed out from newspapers, well, virtually all of them from newspapers, on John Bryan. So he left a lot in that sense. Any questions? Yep.
The colossal barn that was built, where was that, and is there any remains of that barn today?
Location.
One place that it is the foundation stones for the covered bridge in Glen Helen are stones that came from the base of the barn.
Right there at the corner
The
of Round Park.
Yeah, the covered bridge was, I mean, it came from someplace else,
Yeah.
but when they moved it, they put it on stones that had been foundation stones for the barn.
The old barn was right on top of the hill at the campgrounds, where the tent camps are.
Yeah,
Trying to up the top of the hill.
but I don't think there are any stones left there.
Oh, yes,
Are
yes.
there?
You
Are
see
there?
the foundation shown
I
there?
think there's still some foundation work in
Okay.
and around there.
Okay.
I can be going before.
And the house was relatively close to the barn, but I don't know when the house came down. It may have been much earlier.
Well, when you talk about those conditions, which you gave the land, I mean, when I was a student at Bryan High School, I always heard about the fact that he was an atheist and didn't have any religious ceremonies or anything. But I also remember being told that the reason the high school, well, still Bryan, didn't have a football team is because he had specifically, thought it was a violent sport, and had specifically made that condition, but is that not true? Is that just been a myth?
It wasn't reported in any of the papers as being a condition to his gift, and so I think it would have been at the time if it had been. That may have been an excuse for not having a football team.
You know?
And you know, there's lots of rumors about why the no basement. There's at least one account that I found in the Yellow Springs News later on, you know, many years afterwards, that it was because, despite his non-belief in religion, he thought that basements just put you closer to the devils. But I really don't think that. I mean, he claimed to have geology in his background, and so it may well just have been, you know, don't waste your money trying to put a basement there. I don't know.
Another story or tale that I'd heard was that, I guess prior to donating the land to the state, was that he put spikes in the trees.
Yeah, that's been reported that because he was proud of the fact that he had never cut any trees down, and he planted trees. He claimed to have planted virtually every variety of tree that grew in Ohio, and he did claim, and you know, I guess all the ash that they've taken down out there that now makes it look like a clear-cut forest, are probably too young to have been there in John Bryan's time, but you wonder whether there's any, those things ever show up anyplace. But he didn't want them used for lumber,
Right.
so.
The things that were to be published with some of his his bequests, do they survive anywhere?
Not that I've ever been able to find his papers, you know, in any place. Now his widow, as I mentioned, married again a guy named Stube, who's a businessman in Columbus, and she's buried in the mausoleum at I think she died in 1940 in Columbus. And whether those papers ever, she may not have even kept them. She may have, you know, may have, but as far as I've been able to find, there's no trace of them any place that anybody acknowledges.
In the book that you had there, is the writing any good?
It's a little too esoteric for me, but it's a really it's really very odd book. He's got these little fables. He's got 3 introductions interspersed in different places in the book, sort of apologizing for his you know, imposing on the reader, and some of the stories are just they're just odd. But what you'd expect, I mean, he was very proud of this book. I mean, almost every account that you could tell came from him through his later life mentions the fact he claimed himself that he was the greatest living fabulist or fabulist, and that Aesop was the only person that he's buried in Spring Grove Cemetery in Cincinnati.
I suggest in June at the Bryan Center
at the street fair, there be an attempted mule flotation.
I'd be for that. We gotta find a willing mule, but I'd be in favor of that. Yes.
Several times you referred to him as a poet. Have you seen any of his
His,
poetry?
this book is both little short fables and poetry.
Oh.
So there are poems, poems in here. You know, I mean, so here's a short one, I'll just read it. Experience against tears. And this is only 2 paragraphs. A man who had remained a bachelor until 40, finally married, and one day in an altercation with his wife, no, this was written before he got married. In an altercation, his wife sought to gain her point by resorting to tears. At this, he took his hat and cane and walked out of the house saying, "My dear, when a bachelor, I learned to beware of a woman with a tear in her eye." That's yeah, well, or a fable, I don't know. And you know, he was an early member of, it's not the National Association of Women, but a similar type of organization that was in existence then, that's still in existence now. He was a board member of it, so, but he didn't always act the way you think he would.
On a more serious note, I'm interested in how it is that his land for, or partial, is all park, is that, I mean, other land came from other places or parcels? And how did, what was the timing or any coordination between the Glen and the donation of that?
Well, you know, and
then the park, and then the Clifton Gorge Reserve?
I at least one point of that I can address, and I skipped over it because of the time, but I mentioned that right before he died, a year or two before he died, he bought the 115-acre Yellow tract that held the Yellow Springs, would have been the original hotel, from a local guy who had a lumber yard also. And there was some talk in the paper that he was going to reopen it as a park, but he, he actually allowed Antioch to use the springs as a source of water. Scott, you may comment on this, but and then after he died, Antioch, Arthur Morgan was negotiating with his widow and the estate, basically, to buy that parcel, and they had a lawsuit over that. Arthur Morgan sued the widow, actually for the college, because they had backed out. The deal they came up with was they were going to have it appraised, and she didn't like the appraisal that came back on the price. They ended up buying it from the Bryan estate, and then so they already owned it before Hugh Taylor Birch's gift, and that parcel and some other parcels the college gave to Hugh Taylor Birch to give back as one big tract, and so and that doesn't come out a lot of times, but so there's that. He owned property on the south side of the river, and I don't know if that's part of the park now or not. But there were some, and he had some other farms he had bought that added to the east, that added to his original farm, and it became part of the park. But I think the gorge was a later purchase by the state. I don't think that was any. I don't think he ever owned that far east. So, any other questions? Yep.
Is there, interested in his racial stipulation there? Is there any evidence of any writing or participation in any race relations organizations?
I don't know that, I've never seen any evidence he participated in any organizations. I think there's actually some material that's in his book that, you know, believing that everybody was equal and should be treated that way. You know, at a time when that wasn't, I mean, that took a little, well, he was not afraid to take a position outside the norm. But,
well, Yellow Spring schools were integrated before that time, weren't they?
Yeah, there was a lot of controversy in the Yellow Spring schools. I think in the
Eight,
Eight.
94?
Yeah, and so right before he got here, I mean, Yellow Spring schools were not early to integrate,
Right.
Yeah,
so.
I think I heard that the little brick place there on Elm Street was the black schoolhouse.
Is it Elms?
It's
It's in South College, it's the one in South College.
South College.
The Elm Street school was a all school, I mean,
The one in the little white, painted white now. the
yeah,
home.
no, it was, I think it was the brick that's
Yeah.
on South College and what's the, High.
Yeah,
that's the one that was the
That was in the
school for African
1880s.
Americans, yeah.
yeah.
So,
Yeah. Anything else? Yes?
You didn't say anything about putting ground limestone on his alfalfa fields.
He was a big believer in ground limestone, because he had lots of it. And I don't know, I've always been curious if there was the Grinnell Mill had an operation to grind limestone, and whether some of his wasn't instrumental in that as a place to grind his limestone, but he was a big believer and put tons and tons of limestone on his fields for the alfalfa, and had record crops of alfalfa. And he apparently didn't even necessarily have anything to do it. He wanted to prove he could grow it, because there's accounts of it just going to waste in his barn. But he also had, at least one year, had a contract to sell it to O.C. Barber, Ohio Columbus Barber, who was the guy that started the Ohio Match Company up in Barberton, and had a big show farm with a lot of cattle, and Bryan sold him. And there's also an account that I didn't find much of anything about, but supposedly he and Ed Kelly at Whitehall had sort of a rivalry back in the early days of World War I, selling mules to the Army, raising mules and selling them to the Army, which is a little inconsistent with Bryan's anti-war stance, because he really was against war, even if he was for the Germans. So I don't know if there's any truth to that, but supposedly both farms were raising a lot of mules for the Army.
One more.
Sure.
On the path, on the road to where the old swimming pool used to be, there's a path about halfway over that goes down into the glen, or into the creek, gorge. It's got an old barn foundation, a silo foundation. Was that farm part of John Bryan's, or added by the park later on?
You know, I think it belonged to him, but I'd have to, there's,
I could never find any.
I'll show you afterwards. I've got one map that Julie Overton did, because she did a lot of deed record searches of the, what was, here, I can't show the whole group unfortunately, but, so he had added those two farms right there, so that probably includes what you're talking about.
B.S. Stewart. Thank you.
Yes?
Did you ever think about doing a, like a genetics search of him to find out where he came from, genealogy?
Oh, genealogy. I don't want to dig him up to do the DNA search.
Genealogy was the word I
Yeah, Julie did some of that, and some more of it needs to be done, because there's a lot of resources that didn't used to be available easily. And so, like I say, we know where his father and mother were, and where he was born, and some of his brothers. His brothers sued to overturn the will. He didn't like, his brother was a doctor, and I think by the time that Bryan died was in Detroit. He brought a lawsuit to overturn the will. Why he thought he was entitled to more than $1, I don't know, but his lawsuit was thrown out. So
Is he related to Williams Jennings Bryan?
he always claimed that Williams Jennings Bryan was a cousin. It was like a second cousin, and whether that's actually true or not, I'm not sure. But Julie has a quote. I'm not sure where a source for it was, that Williams Jennings Bryan once was asked about John Bryan, and he said, "Yeah, he's a peculiar old man, isn't he?" Yes?
What about his education? Did he have post-high school education?
I would love to know the answer to that.
Okay.
He claimed, we have no idea where he went to
Okay,
school.
that's what I was wondering.
He claims to have studied law, and he claims to have studied medicine, and he claims to have studied geology, but he never, at least where he was ever quoted, said where he studied it.
Oh, okay.
You know, he must have been educated if he was assistant superintendent of schools in Sydney, and may well have taught before that. But where his education came from, totally blank record, and what happened to him, how he got to Cincinnati and the soap company, and owner of the soap company, we have absolutely no idea. I have absolutely no idea.
Did you ask Sydney for their records of who had worked in their educational system?
That's the next step. I tried searching online to see if I could find anything, and I just reported in a history or something, and I haven't, but I've actually got some friends at the Shelby County Historical Society, and so that's the next step. I just haven't had a chance to do it. There's a lot of these little loose ends that would be fun to tie down.
He and Frederica never had any children.
They never had any children. And I don't know what he called her, whether he called her Frida or what. I don't think I mean, I've seen some reference to her as Frida too, but her name was Frederica. Her mother, one of the headlines in one of the newspapers after their wedding was, her mother was a laundress in Cincinnati, so she came from a very poor background. And the report said, the article said that the mother had gotten leave to go to Missouri for this wedding, which didn't last long. But she had to go back to work as a laundress again. So he spoke at his father-in-law's funeral, and that caused a little bit of a ruckus because he spoke at in a chapel, and sort of berating religion as he's at his father-in-law's funeral. He had a lawyer speak at his own funeral, and he built it into his will that he wanted his lawyer to do it. It was supposed to be the executor of his estate too, and the lawyer submitted a bill for $5,000. I don't think it was just for the eulogy, and so Frederica or the estate refused to pay it, and there was a lawsuit over that. More than one lawsuit. Well, thanks everybody for your patience.
Down in a great big rapscale, where a swell-colored bill, by the name of Bill Jefferson, Lord, play piano while he sing a song. He just come and play the whole night.